Tonight we travel back to 18th century Iceland, a place where winter feels like a permanent roommate and love, well, love needs to be carved in stone just to survive. Picture it, the wind howls like a banshee, snow clings to your eyelashes, and the nearest neighbor is half a glacier away. And yet, in all this frozen stillness, someone out there is secretly in love with you. They're not sliding into your DMs or writing cringy poems in your yearbook. Nope, they're sneaking around with knives, carving runes into driftwood by candlelight. Romantic, huh? You're about to witness one of the coldest, harshest environments humans have ever called home, and how that didn't stop them from getting seriously sappy. But quick warning, if you're the kind of person who thinks Iceland is just a frozen Game of Thrones set, you probably won't survive this journey. Not emotionally, at least. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the brittle snow, fur-lined boots crunching softly under your weight. Your breath puffs out in clouds, and the silence here is so total it feels like you're trespassing. Iceland in the 1700s isn't loud, not like cities or taverns. It's a whispering place, wind hissing over stones, firewood snapping in turf houses, and somewhere in the dark, someone's knife scratching into a bone. This is where our story begins. The word love doesn't even exist in Icelandic as we know it today until much later. Instead, affection gets cloaked in metaphors, mythology, and, of course, runes. You wouldn't just say I love you. You'd carve something like, my soul weathers the storm only in your warmth, or something equally intense and snow-drenched. And you wouldn't mail it. You'd hide it. Maybe tuck it into a sheepfold, or leave it etched into the handle of a comb you pass accidentally to your crush. Honestly, modern flirting has nothing on this level of secrecy. You wipe frost off a carved post at the gate of a homestead. There, beneath a curl of wood, a set of runes shimmers in the moonlight. Angular, sharp, almost aggressive yet deliberate. Each line placed not just with meaning but with hope. Maybe even fear. After all, you're not just expressing feelings here. You're risking reputation, family shame, and maybe even exile. But Icelanders of the time are used to walking that line. Centuries of isolation and Lutheran moral strictness have made subtlety an art form. In the winter, days vanish into darkness. And in that darkness, people get introspective. You sit by a hearth in a turf house, the walls thick with sod, the air heavy with the scent of smoke and wool. A teenage girl, let's call her Bryndís, is brushing a lambskin scroll with soot-blackened ink. The candle trembles. She glances at the door and, heart pounding, begins writing in runes. Not just any message, something poetic, risky, maybe a little steamy by Icelandic standards. She'll pass this to John, a shepherd she saw once at the summer gathering. They've never spoken. But he played the fiddle. You're watching an emotional jailbreak, but it's happening in runes. Most households keep their own rune alphabets passed down like family recipes. So unless you're in the know, even if you find the letter, you probably can't read it. Historians still argue whether some rune letters were intended to be understood or just symbolically burned into something physical, like love turned into a spell. Outside, snow thickens like cake batter. John is miles away, tending sheep near a lava field. He's carving something, to his name, maybe hers, maybe just a symbol, a bindrune, twisting their initials together like a Norse monogram. These weren't just scribbles. People believed runes carried power. You didn't just say something with a rune. You made it happen. Writing I long for you wasn't just poetry, it was conjuring desire into the physical world. It's not like everyone's doing this openly. In fact, most rune-writing love affairs are probably never discovered. That's part of the point. But here and there, archaeologists have found hints, rune-inscribed wood chips under hearths, etched messages in abandoned huts, whispers from a world where even the act of feeling something was a little bit rebellious. And yet, with all this intensity, it's not dramatic. Not loud. Icelandic love stories are often about small, quiet persistence. Waiting for spring. Passing a rune-charmed brooch during a community feast. You don't get grand gestures. You get patience. Even today, you can still find some of these carved messages, weathered and barely legible. One fragment, found in a collapsed farmstead, says something like, "I looked once and was never the same." Another just shows two initials, spiraling together like a secret handshake only the cold could keep safe. And as you nestle deeper into your sheepskin bed, maybe you're realizing that love, real, aching, bone-deep love, doesn't need warmth to grow. Sometimes it just needs the right alphabet. You're crouching beside a stream now, the water frozen stiff under a thin crust of ice, and your gloved hand brushes a stone with something odd etched into it. Not just wear and tear or natural cracks, no, this is deliberate. Sharp, tidy slashes angled with purpose. Runes. They don't leap out at you like neon signs, but once your eyes adjust, they whisper louder than ink ever could. This is how Icelanders did it. No paper hearts. No ink-stained stationery. They had stones, bones, wood, and the occasional strip of vellum, basically anything that could hold a scratch without crumbling. And these runes, they weren't just writing. They were a balancing act between secrecy and magic, between communication and charm. Runes had been used in the Norse world for over 1,000 years by this point. But by the 1700s in Iceland, they had become a strange blend of old-school mysticism and romantic shorthand. The Latin alphabet was already in place for church records, legal documents, and all the serious stuff. But for feelings, for late-night carving under candlelight, runes still held sway. Why? Because Latin was for rules. Runes were for rules broken. You're sitting in a dim turf house now, across from a boy no older than 16. His hands are calloused from chopping wood, and he's gripping a lamb bone like it's the most precious object in the world. With the tip of his knife, he's slowly carving a message, each motion careful, like he's not just afraid of mistakes, but of being caught feeling something. It's a secret note, sure, but it's also a ritual. One mainstream fact: runes were often used in galdrastafir, magical staves or symbols meant to attract luck, love, or protection. These symbols crept into romantic letters, too, giving the messages a dual life, a love note and a love charm. Combine that with Icelandic poetic tradition, where metaphors got so layered they bordered on riddles, and you've got letters that are half puzzle, half prayer. Let's say our boy carves a heart. Not the squishy Valentine kind. More like a stylized hearter, wrapped in angular strokes and strange, spiraled additions. Maybe he adds a tiny staff underneath, a bindrune for affection, or luck, or dreams. He doesn't sign his name. That's the point. The recipient will know. Or maybe they won't. Love, in Iceland, often walked that fine line between confession and hopeful haunting. One fringe tidbit: some of these carved messages weren't meant to be given at all. They were buried beneath floorboards, tucked into sheep pens, or hidden in rock crevices like emotional time bombs. The idea wasn't always direct communication. Sometimes, it was enough just to say it to the universe, let the symbols carry the weight. So when you imagine an Icelander writing a love letter, don't picture ink on paper. Picture a teenager hunched in a sheep barn, scratching runes onto the inner rib of a ram, hoping the girl who fetches the meat will somehow notice. Or imagine a girl carving a charm into a stick and tossing it into the river, hoping her secret love downstream will find it and just know. Historians still argue whether these rune messages were always meant to be deciphered. Some scholars believe they were deeply coded, personalized languages only the intended could understand, especially when combined with poetic kennings. Others suggest they were ritualistic, closer to folk magic than messaging. And in a world where Lutheran priests warned against superstitions, that made carving your feelings into driftwood not just romantic, but risky. You shift your weight, snow creaking beneath you, and spot another carving in the base of a crumbling barn wall. It's older than the roof, worn by wind and time, but you can make out the trace of intersecting lines. Maybe a name. Maybe two names. Maybe a binding spell. It's not always clear where language ends and intention begins. Imagine the tension. A boy passes a carved token to a girl during a midsummer gathering. Their fingers brush. She slips it into her sleeve without looking. Neither of them say a word. Her parents are watching. His older brother is nearby, already suspicious. But inside that little charm, scratched into birch or pine, are words no one else will hear. When your eyes found mine, the stars envied us. And this wasn't just idle poetry. The Icelandic tradition of rimma, epic rhymed tales, bled into everyday expression. Young lovers borrowed turns of phrase from ancient sagas and blended them with runes. So a love letter might quote lines about legendary heroes or doomed couples. Think of it as the medieval Icelandic equivalent of texting song lyrics at your crush. You lie back now, your body cushioned in snow, and stare up at the aurora flickering across the sky. Imagine someone centuries ago doing the same, clutching a bone rune inscribed with a secret, watching the lights move and wondering if their love was written in the sky, too. Iceland's landscapes were vast, harsh, and indifferent. But those rune carvings, they were acts of defiance, of tenderness, of stubborn, icy hope. Even in a world where nothing came easy, not food, not heat, not human connection, people still found ways to say, I see you. I want you to know. And just maybe, under all that frost, they were hoping to be seen in return. You're walking now through a narrow path carved between two wind-beaten hills, snow crunching beneath your feet, the sky smeared with violet dusk. There's no sound but your breathing, and somewhere ahead, the distant bleat of a sheep. That's not unusual. In 18th century Iceland, romance doesn't bloom in crowded candlelit ballrooms. It stirs quietly during lambing season, among hay bales, muddy boots, and shared chores. Welcome to courtship, Icelandic style, cold hands, burning cheeks, and absolutely no privacy. You arrive at a small gathering, a few turf-roofed homes clustered near a thawing stream. It's a rare community meetup, a seasonal exchange of goods, news, and maybe, glances. You lean casually on a wooden fence post, trying to look like you're not freezing or awkward. Across the field, someone's daughter passes someone's son a carved walking stick. A gift. No big deal, except you can see the faint glint of runes along the shaft. Subtle. Clever. Probably scandalous. Courtship here isn't just subdued, it's basically camouflaged. The social rules are so strict you could choke on them. Touching in public? Nope. Love declarations? Only if you want your mother to faint and your father to find the axe. This is a place where Lutheranism runs deep and reputations are colder than the fjords. So you learn to be clever, to be careful, and to make every glance, every carved rune, carry the weight of entire unsent letters. One mainstream historical fact, Icelandic youth had very few sanctioned ways to mingle with potential partners. Seasonal gatherings, haymaking, and communal wool work were some of the only times boys and girls might speak freely. In the dead of winter, you couldn't exactly host a mixer. Unless your version of speed dating involves getting stuck in a snowdrift. So what did people do? They sang. Rimma, again, those long narrative poems, became unofficial dating apps. A boy might recite one in public, hinting at someone in the crowd. Maybe he adds a personal twist to the tale. Maybe he weaves in a rune reference only one person will recognize. If you're lucky, she blushes. If you're unlucky, she tells her father and you end up with sheepstall duty for a month. And if you can't sing, well, you carve. One fringe tidbit: during haymaking season, boys and girls often shared the same barns or even bed platforms, sleeping with a separating plank or pile of hay between them. This wasn't always about scandal, it was just about space. But inevitably, stories crept out of whispered conversations, shared songs, or, yes, carved tokens left behind. You duck into one of the barns now, the scent of dried grass still clinging to the air. On a beam above a bunk, there's something scratched, 3 runes and a rough heart symbol. Could be innocent. Could be ancient gossip immortalized in wood. Either way, it tells you what Icelanders already knew: love finds a way, even if the way is full of goats. Historians still argue whether this kind of stealth courtship was empowering or oppressive. Was it thrilling, full of winks, codes, and slow burn tension? Or was it just the byproduct of a culture that stifled emotional expression? There's no easy answer. But what's clear is that even within those constraints, people found ways to speak across silence. And runes were the perfect medium. Back outside, you watch a young woman hand another girl a folded cloth. Just laundry, right? But you spot something peeking from the hem, a tiny carved rune tag, like a name tag turned secret message. This isn't just a love story between boys and girls. Sometimes, these messages crossed lines the church would have burned for. 2 women, perhaps, carving heart bind runes into brooches. 2 men, exchanging rune-etched fishing hooks. It happened. Quietly. Tenderly. Illegally. No one talks about it out loud, not here. But love, like lava, finds cracks. You keep walking. The wind's rising, and your fingers are stiff, but there's a warmth blooming in your chest. You think about how incredibly intentional everything had to be. In our time, a tap on a screen can say "I like you." Back then, it took planning, carving, risk. You couldn't just ghost someone. You had to literally hide your affection inside a sheep barn and pray no one noticed except the one person who was supposed to. And somehow, that made it more real. You stop at another post, brush snow away, and find a carving half covered in moss. It's not words this time. Just 2 intertwined symbols, likely initials, runed together in a looping spiral. Lovers' graffiti, from centuries ago. Not designed to last, but surviving anyway. And that's the thing. Love letters in 18th century Iceland weren't about grand declarations or winning hearts in public. They were about endurance. They were private, personal, and persistent. Little tokens left in barns, beams, buttons. Not because they'd impress someone, but because they had to be made. To express the inexpressible. To whisper over time. And as the snow begins to fall again, you realize, this isn't just history. It's still happening. You wake before dawn. Not because you want to, but because there's a storm growling outside and a turf house doesn't do much to block out the sound of wind chewing through the hills. Inside, it's dim and smoky, the scent of yesterday's fish stew lingering in the air. Across the room, a teenage boy is hunched over something, his breath steaming in the chill, a dull metal blade in his hand. You squint. He's not whittling. He's writing. But not with ink. He's carving a love letter. On a rib bone. Here in 18th century Iceland, paper is precious, ink expensive, and privacy even more so. So what do you do when you need to pour your heart out, but can't afford parchment or the scandal that might come with leaving evidence? You get creative. A sheep's rib, a piece of driftwood, a sliver of birch bark. Whatever can hold a line. You scratch your runes into it, wrap it in wool or tuck it into a bundle of hay, and pass it along like contraband. If you're lucky, it survives the journey. If not, well, Love isn't known for being predictable. Mainstream fact. Icelanders of the time still practiced a form of runic writing known as galdra magic runes, long after most of Europe had switched entirely to the Latin script. And even when using runes for mundane communication, there was often a mystical edge to it. Especially in matters of the heart. There's a reason they didn't just say "I love you." That would be far too simple. Instead, they carved. "Since you smiled, my grindstone turns no more." Which, honestly, is the most Icelandic way of saying you distracted me at work anyone has ever invented. You're crouching now beside the boy as he adds the final rune, blows gently across the bone to scatter shavings. It's a small thing, barely legible. He wraps it in a scrap of cloth and tucks it into a basket bound for a neighboring farm. Risky? Absolutely. But then again, what's love without a little reckless optimism? Sometimes, the carving wasn't even the point. Sometimes the object itself was the letter. A carved spoon. A walking stick. A bone needle case. The gift might serve a purpose, but hidden in its grain, its handle, its smooth underside, was the message. These were functional love letters. And they required both parties to know what to look for. One fringe tidbit: a few carved objects have been found in Icelandic archaeological digs that seem to be practice items, runic phrases repeated over and over, as if the writer were rehearsing a confession they never quite managed to send. Imagine writing "Do you like me?" "Yes, no" on 50 sticks and throwing them all in the ocean, just in case one made it. And these weren't just messages for the living. Some rune-carved love tokens were left at graves. A stick left under a stone, runes scrawled hastily into driftwood and tucked into the earth. Historians still argue whether these were messages of mourning, or something else entirely, longing that never had a chance to speak when the person was alive. Love in Iceland wasn't just for now. It was for the after. But back to our boy and his bone letter. He doesn't know if she'll read it. He doesn't even know if it'll make it past her mother. But when he passes by her family's sheep enclosure days later, he sees a new carving in the fence post. It's faint, almost easy to miss. A spiral rune, feminine. Woven through it, the first rune of his name. She saw. She answered. She used his language. You feel the moment land in your chest like a heartbeat. The rhythm of this romance isn't fast. There's no rush to confession, no fireworks. Just slow, steady carving. Hope layered into material, sharpened into wood and bone and bark. Another example, one preserved in an old folktale, tells of a girl who carved a binding rune into a butter churn, passing it to her love interest's family under the guise of a gift. The rune read something like "May your lips crave only mine." Bold. Butter-related. Iconic. Of course, not every rune letter ended happily. Sometimes they were intercepted, burned, mocked, or answered with silence. The landscape might have been still, but the emotional risk was brutal. Imagine your entire love letter surviving the frozen journey across 3 fjords only to be used as kindling by her disapproving uncle. And yet they still wrote. Historians still argue how widespread this practice was, and whether it represented a norm or an exception. But one thing's certain, the existence of these rune letters, these carved confessions, proves that even in a time and place defined by scarcity, people still made space for beauty. For vulnerability. For stupid, stubborn love. So as the storm howls outside and the boy in the turf house finally rests his knife, you realize something. In Iceland, love didn't just warm the heart. It had to survive the cold. The sun finally rises, barely. Just a sliver of gold scraping the edge of the world before retreating behind snow-laced mountains. You trudge through the crusted earth, boots crunching beneath layers of old frost and new ice. In the distance, someone is herding sheep with a song. Not a cheerful one, exactly. More like a half-sung poem that slips into the wind like smoke. And suddenly you realize, that's how love works here. Not in declarations. In metaphors. You see, Icelanders in the 18th century didn't just write how they felt. They encoded it. Wrapped it up in kennings, those poetic phrases that turn simple truths into riddles. You wouldn't say her smile is beautiful. You'd say her teeth are the winter moon, her lips a fire in the drift. Sounds romantic? Sure. But it's also strategic. Because if someone catches you writing that, they might just assume you're writing a poem about weather. Which, in fairness, is about 90% of Icelandic literature anyway. One mainstream historical fact: kennings date back to the skaldic poetry of the Viking Age, and their influence was still deeply embedded in 18th century Icelandic expression. Young lovers adapted this poetic legacy, crafting love letters so dense with imagery that you needed both a literary education and a good guess to decode them. Picture this. You're in a smoky room, your only light a sputtering candle. You unfold a scrap of vellum, or maybe just a sliver of wood. On it is scratched, "The storm tamer's daughter waits where fire and wool meet." Sounds like something from a saga. But to the right person, that line might say everything. It might mean, "I'll be near the hearth tonight, by the spinning wheel. Meet me." Kennings were safety nets. If intercepted, they offered plausible deniability. "Oh no, mother, I wasn't writing to John. I was composing a saga about a heroic sheep." But in reality, you were confessing how his voice made your bones hum. One fringe tidbit. Some lovers invented private kennings, inside jokes turned into shared code. Sealfire might mean a kiss. Snowsong could be their secret phrase for longing. Imagine falling in love through a shared language that nobody else on the island even knows exists. You'd treasure every metaphor like it was gold. Historians still argue whether some of the more obscure carvings found on artifacts are literal or symbolic. A staff inscribed with knight's anchor in frostlight could be a reference to a myth or a smuggled admission of desire. Without context, we may never know. Which is exactly the point. These letters weren't written for us. They were written despite us. You sit down on a boulder overlooking the fjord. In your gloved hand is a chunk of bark. Someone's etched something into it. Crude, hurried, but legible. You are the flame that haunts my glacier. It's dramatic. But then again, it's Iceland. Everything here is. And these metaphors weren't just artistic flair, they were shields. A way to express overwhelming, possibly inappropriate, maybe even forbidden feelings, without ever saying so plainly. There's a slyness to it, but also a gentleness. Saying "I want to be with you" could land you in shame. Saying "my breath forgets its name in your shadow" might just pass unnoticed by anyone not fluent in your private dialect of longing. Let's talk symbols for a second. Runes on their own were already mysterious. But layer kennings on top of them? You had love notes that read like treasure maps. Some rune letters even included visual puns. A carved horse hoof might stand for a particular meeting place, or a bundled knot might represent intimacy. Think of it as pre-modern emoji flirting. Except with knives. You walk into a long-abandoned shepherd's hut now. The walls are dark with soot, the ceiling low enough to bump your head if you're not careful. But on one of the wooden beams, there's a scrawl. Almost missed it. Just a few lines. "The whale's path widens when you are near. The sea. The space between us." A hint of yearning. Maybe the one who wrote it was watching boats leave, and knew their lover was on one. Or maybe it was just a poetic way to say when you're around, "I can breathe." Either way, it leaves a mark. And what's wild is how deeply these poetic instincts endured. Icelanders were surrounded by natural metaphors: geysers, glacier, storm clouds, northern lights. You didn't need to reach far to compare someone's eyes to molten basalt or their voice to thawing ice. But poetry was more than just metaphor. It was resistance. When you can't say what you feel, because of family, religion, status, distance, you say it sideways. You carve it in metaphor. You tuck it into a love rune. You hide it in a spinning song or wrap it inside the handle of a carved spoon. Even today, Icelanders value metaphor. Their sagas are required reading, their language still bristles with kennings, and their tattoos, often runes, often poetic, often mysterious. And maybe it's because love, like Iceland itself, thrives in what's unsaid. You rise from the hut, step back into the wind. The metaphor now feels more than stylistic. It feels necessary. A veil over vulnerability. A challenge to the reader. A way to say everything without saying anything at all. The sky darkens again, not with night, but with weather, thick, rolling clouds that press low against the hills like a brooding god had a bad day. You're walking along a ridge path, stone crunching underfoot, and you spot a turf-roofed cottage down below, almost buried in frost. There's smoke curling from the chimney, which means someone's home. And someone, probably, is in love. Because here's the truth of it, in 18th century Iceland, love often had to stay hidden. Which is why tonight, you're slipping quietly into the realm of forbidden romance, a world of glances traded beneath church pews, hands brushed in sheep stalls, and yes, cloaks shared under the stars. You duck into the low doorway, greeted by the thick scent of wood smoke, wet wool, and boiled fish. The kind of aroma that says, "Welcome home." Inside, a girl leans by the hearth, spinning wool. Her name might be Ragnar. Her cheeks are red from the wind, and she hums while she works. Across from her, sharpening a knife, is John, the farmhand. Technically, they're not supposed to talk much. Definitely not supposed to be interested in each other. But there's a cloak hanging on the peg behind them. And in Icelandic folklore, that cloak might as well be a wedding ring. One mainstream historical fact: in rural Iceland, it wasn't uncommon for young people, especially those working together on farms, to share sleeping spaces during long winters. Sometimes they slept with a board separating them, in theory, sometimes with nothing but shared blankets. These arrangements weren't necessarily scandalous, unless feelings got involved. Then it got complicated. Fast. You watch as Ragnar reaches for that cloak. It's big, heavy, made of rough wool. She drapes it over both their shoulders as the fire flickers lower. On the outside, it's just about warmth. But you know better. Sharing a cloak was intimate. A non-verbal confession. And if you happened to carve a rune into the hem before draping it over someone's shoulders, well, that's practically a proposal. Assuming they noticed. And assuming they wanted to notice. One fringe tidbit. Some surviving cloaks from the era have been found with tiny stitch patterns or binding runes sewn into the inside lining. Not for decoration. For messages. They were love letters you could wear, assuming no one else looked too closely. Ragnar and John don't speak. Not now. But you can feel the air between them vibrate like harp strings. Every movement is loaded. She passes him the spindle, fingers brush. He sets the knife down gently, edge turned away, a small gesture of care. These people don't flirt like we do. They don't joke or tease or overshare on social media. They just exist a little closer than they should. And of course, there's always the risk. Love like this doesn't stay secret forever. Neighbors talk. Parents notice. And in a small Icelandic community, privacy is basically a myth. You leave a carved stick in someone's knitting basket and suddenly the entire valley knows about it. Which is why couples got clever. Runes were written on inside seams, on the handles of shared tools, carved beneath stools or onto the base of a cup. In one folktale, a girl named Sigrun wrote a runic message into the shaft of her brother's axe, just a tiny curl of longing for a boy who lived 2 fjords away. He found it while borrowing the tool. returned it with a matching rune carved into the handle. A secret courtship conducted entirely through wood and steel. Romantic, and completely untraceable. Unless you knew where to look. Historians still argue whether most of these pairings were spontaneous or arranged. Families often had expectations. Marriages were strategic. But hearts? Not always cooperative. Sometimes love crossed class lines. Farmhands fell for landowners' daughters. Widows eyed younger men. And in those moments, runes became lifelines, ways to speak without consequence, to confess without confession. You step outside again. The wind has quieted, but the air still hums. Across the field, two figures are walking. You can't see faces, but you know the rhythm, the slow, side-by-side drift of people who haven't said everything yet, but could. One of them carries a staff. Just a walking stick, really. But as they pass under the moonlight, you spot a faint glint, a carving. You don't know what it says. But it doesn't matter. What matters is why it was carved. Even today, there are stories of Icelanders finding rune-covered sticks buried near old farmsteads. Most are undecipherable. But some hold echoes, two initials. A heart bond. A phrase that doesn't make sense out of context, like, until the sheep return. What sheep? Whose? Maybe it was just a way of saying, I'll wait for you. You sit now on a stone wall, cloak pulled around your shoulders, and think about how powerful that must have felt. To risk shame, expulsion, even punishment, just to carve someone's name into your wall lining. To carry it close, unseen, every day. Because even if the world didn't approve, even if no one else ever knew, you would know. And somehow, that was enough. That's what makes this kind of love unforgettable. Not because it was loud, or bold, or cinematic. But because it survived in shadows. It thrived on glances, symbols, fabric, and frost. A love that didn't need to be seen to be real. A love that, like so many in Iceland's long winters, learned how to keep warm under the same cloak. The hearth is crackling now, low and steady, casting gold across the soot-streaked beams of a turf house. You're sitting cross-legged on a sheepskin, watching a girl, let's call her Aura, dip a brush into a small jar of blackened ink. It's thick, homemade, probably a mix of soot, animal fat, and whatever desperation looks like in liquid form. Her brow furrows. The vellum before her is precious. One mistake and she's wasted something nearly sacred. But she has to write this. Because runes carved into bones and sticks are useful for passing quick secrets. But sometimes, love needs more space. Welcome to the slightly riskier, slightly fancier world of inked runes on vellum, where 18th century Icelanders tried their hand at old-fashioned calligraphy with a side of butterflies in the stomach. And no delete button. You glance over Aura's shoulder. The runes are neat, each line careful and trembling. This isn't a spell. Not exactly. It's a letter. The kind you don't hand to someone in the daylight. The kind you bury under their pillow or slip inside the seam of their mitten. If it gets found, she'll say it's just a copied verse from a poem. A practice exercise. A tribute to the sagas. Sure. One mainstream historical fact, vellum, calfskin parchment, remained in use in Iceland long after most of Europe had moved on to paper. It was durable, reusable, and available if you didn't mind sacrificing a calf or two. Most families couldn't afford to waste it on personal letters, but some fragments have survived, and a few, well, they read a little too poetic to be prayers. You watch as she writes. Let your voice be the warmth that thaws my longest night. A little dramatic. Of course. But this is a girl raised on heroic sagas, ghost stories, and winter nights that never end. Her idea of romance is halfway between a Norse epic and a fever dream. And honestly, who can blame her? Aura isn't just writing how she feels. She's making it real. Ink on vellum is permanent. Carvings fade, but vellum endures. That's why it's risky. Because if someone finds this, they know she meant it. This isn't a rune on a butter churn that could have been accidental. This is a letter. A vulnerable, physical thing that says, I've thought about you enough to kill a baby cow for this. And let's not forget, inked runes didn't just spell out words. They were often combined, layered symbols, shaped into protective staves or romantic charms. Bind runes wrapped around whole sentences, like spell thread woven into a scarf. One fringe tidbit. Some people believed that burning a vellum rune letter and breathing in the smoke would carry your emotions to the intended person, which is either touching or mildly toxic. Auroress brush pauses. She adds a final flourish, her personal rune, a kind of signature. It's not her name. That would be too obvious. It's a twist of symbols, maybe the first letter of her name, blended with something he once carved into a tree. A shared language, used once, now burned into this thin skin. She folds it carefully, tucks it into the hem of a wool mitten that she'll deliver with the next batch of laundry. No one will think twice. Unless, of course, they unfold it. And then, well, that's when the drama begins. Historians still argue whether vellum rune letters were commonly exchanged, or if these few examples we've found are just extreme cases, exceptions that slipped through the cracks. But the fact that any survived at all suggests they meant something. Not just as communication, but as keepsakes. Maybe someone couldn't throw it away. Maybe it was hidden in a chest, or under a floorboard, or inside a wall. Some even theorize that these letters were part of a larger ritual, written by moonlight, sprinkled with herbs, sealed with a kiss. That last part? Definitely not documented. But come on, you know someone did it. You move to a low shelf in the turf house, dust brushing your fingers. Behind a stack of folded wool, there's something flat. You ease it out. A scrap of brittle calfskin, ink faded but intact. The runes curl like vines across the surface. It's not long. Just a few lines. Maybe written by someone like Aura. Maybe even her. Your name lingers longer than sunlight. Even in my sleep. You exhale. It hits harder than you expect. This is what sets these inked rune letters apart. They're intimate. Slow. Less about passing secret signals and more about capturing emotion the way a photo might today. The idea that someone took hours, days, maybe, to find the right words, the right symbols, the right skin, just to say, I think of you, it kind of wrecks you. And again, there's the risk. If a parent found this, it'd be a disaster. If a priest found it, might call it superstition. Or worse, temptation. Remember, Lutheran influence in Iceland was strong. Anything that hinted at mysticism or romantic magic was cause for alarm. You weren't supposed to be whispering your feelings into lambskin like a sorceress with a crush. But they did it anyway. Because sometimes love needed more than splinters and secrecy. Sometimes it needed to be soft, fluid, lingering. Like ink soaked into the grain of skin. You roll the vellum gently and replace it on the shelf. The house is quiet again, fire flickering low. Somewhere, Aura is asleep. Or awake, wondering if her letter has reached its destination. Maybe the boy who received it is rereading it by candlelight, tracing each rune with his finger. Or maybe he tucked it away in his pillow, hoping to dream of her. Either way, the message endures. Love, in this world, doesn't fade with time. It gets written into things that last. Snow taps gently against the turf roof like fingers drumming a lullaby. You're wrapped in a woolen cloak now, warm despite the deep cold outside, and your eyes are adjusting to a dimly lit attic above a farmhouse. It's cramped, smells like old straw and wood smoke and something else. Ink. Resin. A hint of burnt herb. This is no ordinary storage loft. This is a place where someone worked magic. Or tried to. Because tonight, you're stepping into one of the strangest, most whispered about corners of Icelandic romance, the place where love letters blurred into spellcraft. Runes weren't always just messages. Sometimes they were incantations. And when love was desperate enough, the two became indistinguishable. You kneel near an old wooden chest, lift the lid, and breathe out slowly. Inside are scraps, carved sticks bundled with twine, folded vellum squares, a dried flower tied with a red thread, and a stone with a bind rune burned into its face. This isn't storage. This is someone's collection of hopes. One mainstream historical fact: Iceland had a rich and persistent tradition of magical practice well into the 18th century, despite strong religious suppression. Folk magic, ᛒᚱᚁᛊᛏ, was alive and well in secret. Love magic, in particular, was often practiced by those who lacked social or economic power, young women, farmhands, and anyone whose love was considered inconvenient. You pick up one of the sticks. It's charred slightly at one end, and etched with a symbol you've seen before, a love stave, a kind of bind rune meant to stir affection or draw attention. It's not elaborate, but it's focused. Someone didn't just hope to be noticed. They tried to make it happen. Now, let's be clear, these weren't love potions in the fairy tale sense. No one was cackling into a cauldron while muttering in runic tongues. Well, probably not. But the belief was there. That you could craft a symbol, carve it under the right moon, pair it with a whispered name, and maybe, just maybe, nudge fate. One fringe tidbit. Some love staves were meant to be carried in your shoe. Hidden there, close to the ground, they were thought to draw the beloved toward you, even across mountains. Like ancient tinder, but with splinters and hiking. You flip through a folded piece of vellum and read, "Let their eyes seek me as the sun seeks sea." Below that, a charm. Not a full stave, but a series of looped and intersected runes, bent and stretched into a kind of visual net. A trap for attention. A magnetic snare for glances. Did it work? Who knows? But someone believed it might. Someone needed it to. Historians still argue whether the people who made these charms truly believed in their power, or if they were just performing rituals because it gave them some control in an unpredictable world. But love magic has always sat in that gray area. Maybe it wasn't about belief. Maybe it was about desperation. Or intention. Or the comfort of doing something. You glance over at the small window. Frost has crept across the glass in lacy patterns. You imagine a girl sitting here decades ago, fingers red from the cold, burning herbs in a dish while whispering a name. Not to harm. Just to call. To be heard. To matter. Another object catches your eye, a rough clay pendant strung on a leather cord. The glaze has long since worn off, but there's a carved rune on the back, barely visible. You run your thumb across it. A symbol for desire, maybe, or longing. This wasn't made to be shown off. It was probably worn under clothing, pressed against skin. A secret close to the heart. People didn't just write about love. They tried to shape it. To bend it, bind it, beckon it. And when the natural channels were blocked by family, class, gender, or fear, they reached for anything that might give them a chance. One old tale tells of a farmhand who etched a complex love stave into the barn beam where his secret crush tended the sheep. Every time she leaned on that post, his heart jumped like a startled lamb. And sure enough, months later, they married. Was it fate? Was it love? Was it successful rune magic? Depends who you ask. Of course, not all these experiments ended happily. There are darker stories. A rune charm that backfired. A love letter misread. A binding spell that worked a little too well, stirring obsession instead of affection. Those tales are whispered, usually late at night, when candles flicker and no one wants to admit how real it all still feels. Even now, Some Icelanders won't touch certain symbols, out of respect, or caution, or something they won't quite name. But the vast majority of these rune charms were simple, human, hopeful. They weren't about control. They were about connection. A way of saying, I need you to feel this too. You sit back, the attic around you settling with the gentle creaks of an old house remembering old lives. You can picture the people who passed through here. Not sorcerers. Just young lovers. Just people who weren't allowed to say what they felt out loud, so they whispered it through symbols and smoke instead. You smile, brushing your hand along the rim of the wooden chest. Maybe love isn't magic, but sometimes it sure acts like it. You descend the narrow stairs from the attic, ducking your head so you don't smack into the low beam, and return to the common room. The fire's out. Cold air has crept back in, curling around your ankles like a polite ghost. Outside, the weather has eased just enough to tempt you out again. You pull your cloak tight, step through the creaky door, and find yourself in a different kind of quiet. The sky is smudged with ash-colored clouds. Somewhere in the distance, a raven croaks, breaking the stillness with a voice like old leather. You follow a footpath behind the house, past a stone fence, down a hill slick with ice, and there it is. A graveyard. Fenced in by low rocks. Half swallowed by snowdrifts. No flowers. Just stones, some so old the runes have worn smooth. And yet, you feel it right away. This place is full of stories. Tonight, we're diving into one of the most tender and bittersweet traditions, the love letters left behind. Because while Icelanders in the 18th century were excellent at hiding their feelings during life, they didn't always stop writing after death. You walk slowly between the stones. Some are marked with runes, others with names in careful Latin script. But every now and then, you spot something else, something faint. Carved into the side of a grave marker, or etched onto a piece of driftwood laid beside it. Not names. Not prayers. Messages. One mainstream historical fact: it wasn't uncommon for Icelanders to visit graves and leave objects, sticks, bones, scraps of cloth, sometimes carved with symbols or words. Whether these were acts of mourning, communication, or ritualized memory is still debated, but their presence is undeniable. And some of them, read like love letters. You kneel beside one such stone now. Someone has wedged a piece of weathered wood into a crack near the base. You pull it out gently, brushing off frost. There, barely visible, are the words. You took the sun with you. No name. No sender. Just grief, sharpened to a point, then left behind like a final whisper. One fringe tidbit. There's evidence that in some regions, young lovers would leave love runes at the grave of a lost partner on the anniversary of their death, often in secret. Some were as simple as a single initial. Others were full letters, folded and sealed, buried in the snow. Tokens of love that never had a chance to be spoken. The Icelandic sagas are full of ghosts. Restless spirits. Love that lingers. And maybe that shaped how people mourned. How they kept talking. There was this idea that the dead heard you. That if you left a message, carved into a stick or whispered at night, it would reach them. You pass another stone. There's a circle of pebbles arranged around its base. Not random. Intentional. Maybe symbolic. Maybe a marker. Maybe just the work of someone who needed to do something with their hands while missing someone. Historians still argue whether these grave messages were personal or ritualized. Some say they were part of folk practices tied to memory and ancestral respect. Others argue they were simply spontaneous, raw emotion turned physical. Either way, the result is the same. People kept writing, even when there was no reply. You find another token, a small bone, likely a rib, with runes scratched along one side. It's so faint you can barely make them out. A name, you think. Followed by, always in Thor. A metaphor, maybe, or a private meaning. But it stays with you. Love like this isn't loud. It doesn't come with fanfare or declarations. It's quiet, patient. Sometimes years pass, decades, and someone still comes here to remember. There's a legend from the Westfjords about a woman who lost her betrothed in a sea accident. She visited his grave every year on the first day of summer and left a carved walking stick beside his headstone. Each stick had a different rune, one for waiting, one for memory, one for forgiveness. Locals say she did this until her own death. No one knows where the sticks are now. Maybe the earth swallowed them. Or maybe someone tucked them away, unwilling to let them vanish. And really, that's the haunting part of all this. Love letters written to the dead don't expect a response. But they still get written. You sit on a stone bench now, chilled but rooted. A breeze stirs the dry grass around the graves, and you think about how strange it is that we call these people superstitious or dramatic. As if writing a message to someone you miss is somehow irrational. As if carving your sorrow into driftwood makes you foolish. But maybe it makes you human. And maybe, back then, love wasn't finished just because life was. You rise slowly. Leave the bone exactly where you found it, tucked back against the stone. You're not here to disturb, just to witness. And as you walk away, you glance over your shoulder one last time. The graveyard stands still, silent. But now you know what's buried isn't just people. It's love. In pieces. In runes. In Thor. The path winds down from the graveyard, your boots leaving shallow prints in the frost-dusted moss. The valley below is still, hushed under the hush of early evening, where the only movement is the slow drift of mist curling along the riverbank. But in the distance, beyond a pair of snow-laced hills, something flickers, a small wooden schoolhouse, barely large enough to hold a dozen students. You head there now, curious. Because tonight, we're peeling back another unexpected layer in the world of Icelandic love letters, when romance met literacy and the classroom became the post office. You push the creaky door open. It smells like chalk and sheep tallow. Desks are arranged in uneven rows, each one carved with initials, scratches, and the occasional runic doodle. It's cold, of course, but the room buzzes with memory. Icelanders in the 1700s were surprisingly literate for a rural population scattered across such a dramatic landscape. Thanks in part to the Lutheran Church's emphasis on scripture reading, boys and girls were often taught their letters. One mainstream historical fact: by the 18th century, Iceland had one of the highest literacy rates in Europe, despite lacking formal schools in many regions. Teaching happened at home or through itinerant tutors, often older students or clergy, who traveled between farms with satchels full of books, ink, and gossip. And with literacy came opportunity. Not just to read the Bible, but to read and write everything else. Like, say, heartfelt notes to a certain someone across the valley. You settle into one of the rickety desks. Someone's carved a small phrase into the top Latin script, this time, not runes. You squint and trace the letters. E.g. lite igmi von I harta. I look at you with hope in my heart. Now, imagine being 14. You're surrounded by siblings, grandparents, and sheep. There's no privacy. No internet. No journals. But you can write. And if you're clever, you slip that folded letter into the cover of the Passíusalma, the Passion Hymns of Hallgrímur Pétursson, Iceland's go-to 17th century devotional. And when class ends, you quietly pass it to Jonas, who's absolutely pretending he didn't see it. This wasn't just a rare occasion. Love letters were an unofficial extracurricular. Teachers turned a blind eye. Sometimes even helped. One fringe tidbit. There are rumors of certain rural priests who taught kids runic calligraphy not just to preserve tradition, but because they knew those kids would use it to write things that weren't strictly biblical. You look up at the blackboard. Faint chalk still clings to its surface. You imagine the room full of young voices, some muttering conjugations, others secretly watching a pair of hands meet briefly beneath a shared woolen shawl. A wink. A blush. A slip of folded paper slid into a mitten. Historians still argue whether this early education directly encouraged romantic letterwriting, or if the two simply coexisted. But there's no denying the overlap. Where there was ink, there was emotion. Where there was language, there was longing. And sometimes, that longing had a curriculum. You open a drawer in the teacher's desk and find a small sheaf of folded papers tied together with twine. It feels like you're about to read someone's diary, but then again, you kind of are. The first is a simple poem. Clumsy, but sincere. She spins wool, and I am spun. The next is bolder. Your braid, a rope that binds me gladly. The last is heartbreak in 5 words. He left before I could. No dates. No signatures. Just words, recorded in the margins of youth and winter, passed hand to hand like sacred contraband. You close the bundle gently, respectful of the centuries that separate you from the ache on those pages. Back then, love had to be creative. There were no telegraphs. No letters mailed with stamps. Instead, you gave your note to a cousin heading in the right direction. Or hid it in a basket of wool. Or copied it into a friend's notebook and trusted that it would get where it needed to go. Sometimes, it did. Sometimes, it didn't. But always, someone was writing. And these weren't just sweet nothings. Sometimes they were fierce. Complex. Honest. A boy might write 10 pages explaining how he couldn't afford to marry yet, but he would, if she'd just wait until lambing season paid off. A girl might quote from the Eddas to describe her feelings, hoping he'd catch the reference. Letters often included lines from Psalms, reworked as metaphors for longing, because the safest place to hide love was inside something pious. And always, there was that fear. That someone else would find it. So you learned to disguise your truth. In metaphor. In joke. In secret rune. A game of layered meaning, taught between lessons on grammar and geography. You rise from the desk, stretching the cold from your joints. Outside the window, it's nearly dusk. The last light slips between the mountains like a shy promise, and the air smells of dry hay and candle ends. You step outside again, feeling oddly full. Like you've been handed 100 unopened envelopes, each filled with the fragile breath of someone brave enough to say, I feel something. In the schoolhouse behind you, ink still stains the desks. Scratches still haunt the walls. And even if the voices are gone, their words, hidden in textbooks, carved into wood, linger. And maybe, on a quiet night, if the wind blows just right, you'll hear one of them whisper your name. The schoolhouse fades behind you as you follow the ridge trail again, wind tugging at your cloak like an impatient child. It's darker now. The snow glows faintly with starlight, and the path you're walking winds along the edge of a cliff that drops into a vast, frozen fjord. Everything's hushed except for the crunch of your steps and the low, rhythmic hiss of the sea ice shifting below. Tonight, we're climbing even higher, not just across this ridge, but into the wild letters sent across the wilderness. Because in 18th century Iceland, when love couldn't live nearby, it learned to travel. Over mountains, across rivers, through storms that tried very hard to kill the mailman. You're standing now beside a waystone, one of many scattered across old travel routes. Carved with directional runes, these stones kept wanderers alive. And some of them also carried love notes. One mainstream historical fact, Iceland's postal system in the 1700s was more relay race than infrastructure. Letters were carried on foot or horseback, passed between farms, churches, and ferrymen. It could take weeks for a message to travel what today would be a casual drive. Especially in winter. And yet, they still wrote. Imagine a girl, bundled in furs, handing a sealed letter to her brother before he sets out on a 4-day journey to a fishing village. She doesn't say what's in it. He doesn't ask. He just tucks it into his satchel beside dried fish and a carved charm for protection. 4 days later, that letter arrives in a salt-stained hut beside the shore, where a boy with cracked hands reads, "When the wind bends, I bend toward you." That's love across the Icelandic wilderness, slow, frozen, and utterly determined. One fringe tidbit. There's record of a traveling midwife who acted as a secret mail courier. She'd collect messages, some political, some personal, some heartbreakingly romantic, and smuggle them between valleys tucked inside the hems of her apron or bound into bundles of herbs. She was a mobile post office with better gossip than any town square. You continue along the trail, past another stone marker, this one with a stick wedged into a crevice. It's splintered at the end, but still legible. "See you when the horses return." Is it a note? A joke? A promise? Doesn't matter. Someone took the time to stop, to carve, to leave something behind. And someone else, like you, is meant to find it. Historians still argue whether these wilderness messages were prearranged drop points or spontaneous acts of desperation. Some say lovers developed entire waypoint codes, specific stones or landmarks where messages could be tucked and later retrieved. Others think these were just wild declarations, like writing "I was here" with more emotional consequences. You crouch beside a dry patch of grass, brushing away snow to reveal a small stack of flattened stones. Someone's hidden something beneath them. A bone comb, etched with runes. You pick it up and turn it over. You untangle what winter knots. A metaphor. A message. Maybe even an inside joke between two people who'd shared cold seasons and colder silences. Whatever it is, it was meant to be found. Maybe not by you, but still. This is what lovers did when they were separated by distance, by geography, by angry fathers or arranged marriages or simply bad luck. They kept writing. And they got creative. They sent messages on the backs of tax ledgers, tucked notes into books passed between neighbors, carved runes into the handles of tools borrowed and returned across great distances. And when no one else could carry it, they trusted the land. One old tale, half folklore, half local legend, tells of a girl who tied her message to a sheep's bell. Her family was trading flocks with another farm 2 valleys over. She knew the ram would arrive by spring, and with it, her letter. The story goes that she married the boy who found it. Which sounds sweet until you realize she probably had to wait months just to find out if he got it. That's the kind of patience 18th century Icelandic love required, not just romantic, but seasonal. You reach the summit of the ridge now. The wind is fierce here, so you crouch behind a stone shelter, just enough cover to rest. In the distance, the moon reflects on the fjord like a silver thread stitched through shadow. And tucked into the rocks beside you, one more message. Faded, half buried, but legible. To the one who walks after me, I thought of you here. It doesn't even say who. Doesn't need to. It's not always about knowing the sender. It's about knowing that someone, at some point, loved hard enough to mark the earth with their longing. That someone felt enough to speak into the wind and hope their voice reached somewhere. Maybe that's what these messages were really about. Not just about reaching someone, but about reaching out. Into silence. Into cold. Into the staggering loneliness of a winter that feels like it might never end. And in that silence, they left love behind like breadcrumbs. So someone else might follow it home. You descend from the ridge as the stars unfurl fully above you, pinpricks of silver that feel strangely close in the crisp night air. Your boots crunch through fresh frost. The wind has dropped to a hush, and in the valley below, you see a glow flickering behind a low stone wall. Lanterns. Dozens of them. Some swinging from hooks. Others resting on ledges. A few are cradled in laps by people gathered around what looks like a wedding. No big church. No fancy hall. Just a gathering in the open air, wrapped in cloaks, cheeks red with cold, smiles flickering in the firelight. And right at the center, standing beneath a carved wooden arch woven with sheep's wool and rowan twigs, are two people holding hands. Tonight, you're witnessing what happened when all those hidden notes, coded cloaks, rune sticks, and whispered longings finally worked. The rare but real moment of confession, proposal, and public declaration. And trust me, after all that sneaking around, this is a very big deal. You find a seat on a low wall, watching as an older woman, maybe the local Kona, midwife, wise woman, unofficial chaos manager, steps forward and raises a vellum sheet. It isn't a sermon. It's a letter. Handwritten. You know before she speaks, this is how it begins. One mainstream historical fact: Icelandic marriage traditions in the 18th century still held firm to older Norse customs, including the reciting or reading of symbolic texts, often involving property, lineage, and household unification. But when love snuck in, something else happened too. People brought their own words. And sometimes, those words were rune letters. You listen as the woman begins to read aloud, and your skin prickles. I wrote your name before I knew it. I carried it on sticks, in sleep, in storm. I send it to you now, not carved, but carried in my chest. That's not a legal document. That's a love letter. One they wrote each other. One they chose to have read aloud, under the open sky, as part of this moment. A public declaration shaped not by church decree, but by years of hidden glances, snow-buried tokens, and ink pressed deep into skin and page. And the best part? Everyone here understands. Every person seated under wool and stars has either done this or dreamed about doing it. One fringe tidbit. In some communities, it was traditional for couples to read each other poems, some in verse, others in runes, as part of their betrothal or wedding. These confession texts were often kept secret until the moment of union, meant to surprise the other and publicly seal a private truth. Think of it as a vow, a flex, and a romantic mic drop all in one. The woman steps back, and the groom responds, not with a poem, but with a carving. He lifts a plank of driftwood, marked with runes. Holds it up in both hands. It's worn, smoothed by years of handling, but clear enough to read. Let me be your hearth, when your house is cold. It's not flashy, but it's got weight. You can see the bride's face crumble into laughter and tears, all at once. That plank's probably older than this moment. Something he carved years ago and finally had the courage to bring out tonight. A relic of a feeling finally finding daylight. Historians still argue whether these ritual confessions were widespread or limited to more romantic pockets of Icelandic life. But we do know that love letters often ended up being kept stitched into dowries, passed into chests, bound with prayer books. Some weren't meant to be shown. Others became centerpieces. The rune that sealed the secret became the rune that sealed the vow. The bride steps forward now. She's not reading anything. She just lifts the edge of her cloak, revealing the inner seam. Along it, stitched in dark wool thread, is a line of runes. You can't read all of them, but a few stand out. His name shelters me. That's it. Her entire wedding vow sewn into the lining of her own clothing. No need to speak it. It's already there. Carried. Lived in. You glance around the circle of onlookers. Some are smiling through tears. Some are nodding like, yep, that's how you do it. A few are probably plotting their own versions right now. And maybe this is what it was always building toward. All those secret messages. All those risky rune sticks and vellum poems and carved spoons. They weren't just about confession. They were about this moment. About saying, I did all of that because I couldn't not love you. It wasn't easy. Nothing about love here was. The terrain, the weather, the expectations, all of it stood in the way. And still, they carved. They stitched. They waited. They hoped. Until, finally, someone stood beside someone else and said, "This is mine." You shift slightly on the wall as the final part of the ceremony unfolds. Two pieces of driftwood are tied together with braided horsehair, each with runes carved on them. They're bound and placed in the hearth ash, symbolizing shared warmth, joint endurance, and probably just a little fireproof stubbornness. The couple walks away together, cloaks wrapped as one, and the lanterns are lifted. One by one, they float upward, small flames carried into the sky like tiny rune letters of light. And you realize, this wasn't just a wedding. It was a culmination. A reminder that in 18th century Iceland, love wasn't shouted from rooftops. It was written, patiently, creatively, defiantly. And when it finally got its moment, it glowed like fire in the snow. You follow the flickering glow of lanterns as the wedding guests drift away, their laughter and footsteps soft against the frozen ground. The couple has disappeared down the path, and only a few lights remain. But the air is still warm with something you can't quite name. Joy, maybe. Relief. Or just the feeling of a story finally finishing its arc. Still, as the lanterns dim, another question stirs. Not everyone got to end their love story in a ceremony. Some letters went unanswered. Some feelings stayed folded inside pockets, worn thin with time. And others were intercepted. Stolen. Hidden. Tonight, we turn the page to something quieter, sadder, and entirely human, the fate of love letters never delivered. You arrive now at an abandoned turf house, half swallowed by a collapsed hillside. Moss covers the roof like a burial shroud. One wall has given way to time, exposing a broken shelf, a pile of rotted books, and an overturned chair still shaped like someone used to sit in it every night. You slip inside. Cold rushes in behind you. And there on a narrow table under a broken window is a locked wooden chest. It's been scorched by fire at some point, the edges darkened, but it's intact. Barely. You kneel, lift the rusted latch, and inside, a box of letters. All sealed. All unsent. One mainstream historical fact: Icelandic households often kept chests of personal papers, contracts, inheritance records, sermons, and yes, letters. Many such chests have been found in abandoned homes, containing documents that never saw their destination. Some were unsent. Others were kept hidden, deliberately never mailed. You lift one vellum square, tied with coarse thread. The seal is unbroken. A single rune is carved into the wax elgin, the symbol for perseverance. You hold it gently, aware you're cradling someone's secret. A hope never acted on. You don't open it. That's not what it's for anymore. Beside it is a bundle wrapped in wool. You unfold it and find a letter with no seal, just folded vellum, faded ink, and pressed herbs still clinging to the crease. You read, "I wrote this so I would stop waking up hoping. If you never see it, then it cannot ruin you." That sentence stays with you for a while. One fringe tidbit. In some households, people deliberately wrote burn letters, emotional outpourings they never intended to send. Some of these were burned as ritual closure. Others, curiously, were stored. Hidden behind beams. Stuffed inside chimney cracks. Maybe they couldn't part with the feeling, even if they couldn't share it. Historians still argue whether these unsent letters were acts of caution or catharsis. Did people plan to deliver them someday? Or were they intentionally unsent, messages meant only for the page? Were they the equivalent of talking to yourself in ink? You scan another letter, its ink running at the edges. It's angry. You said I was foolish to wait. But what did you wait for? Not all letters were kind. Some burned long before they were ever lit. But they're still love letters. Because love isn't just sweetness and runes and handfastings under starlight. Sometimes it's messy, sharp, unanswered. Sometimes it lives in a drawer for decades, daring anyone to look. In the corner of the chest is a rune stick. Small. Bone, not wood. You lift it. Its surface is smoothed from being handled again and again. Someone couldn't stop touching it. Couldn't throw it away. The runes are faint, but still legible. If not in this life, that's it. That's the whole message. You close your eyes and imagine someone writing that. Alone, probably. Heart-aching, maybe. Or maybe just resigned. Love, distilled into 5 words and a breath held forever. There's a reason we keep letters, even if we never send them. There's a reason we write things we hope no one sees. Because the act of writing is the release. A proof. A claim. A final say. You glance around the ruined house at the shadows on the walls, the papers fluttering in the broken light. This wasn't a place where love flourished. But it's where love lived anyway. Quietly. Privately. Scratched into vellum and bone. Hidden behind the ordinary. Because sometimes, what doesn't get delivered is just as powerful as what does. You return the letter to its wool wrap. Close the chest. Leave it exactly as you found it. This isn't a museum. It's a tomb. A shrine. A memory pile. And even if the words were never read by the right person, they were written. They existed. And now, someone else knows they were here. And that's enough. The wind picks up as you leave the ruin behind, threading through the hills like a tired sigh. You follow a narrow track now, one that loops around a frozen creek and through a copse of stunted birch trees, their limbs rattling like wooden wind chimes. The sky above is heavy with stars, and the moon hangs low and full, bright enough to read by. And it's a good thing too. Because now, you're stepping into a space that lives half in truth, half in myth. Tonight, we enter the world of forged letters, phantom authors, and literary pranks. Yes, you heard that right. For every sincere runic declaration of eternal love, there were also letters that were never quite what they seemed. At the edge of the birch grove is a small farmstead, still standing. This one isn't abandoned. In fact, a candle glows in the window. You don't knock, this place belongs to the past, and you're just passing through. Inside, you find a writing desk. On top of it, a quill, a blotter, a bundle of faded papers, and something else. A letter. Signed, sealed, addressed, but the name at the bottom? It's fake. One mainstream historical fact: Icelanders in the 18th century, despite their relative isolation, were no strangers to literary mischief. Especially among the literate and bored, forging letters from others, especially romantic ones, became a subtle form of flirtation, teasing, or occasionally, social sabotage. Yes, people wrote love letters and signed them with someone else's name. Sometimes it was a joke. Sometimes it was not. You lift the letter. It reads, "My dearest Brynhilda, I saw you once through the smoke of the sheep pen and nearly forgot how to breathe. Also, I think I left my gloves there. Please return them if love is not returned." At first it's sweet, then ridiculous. But the seal, it belongs to a very real family. Someone forged this. Maybe as a joke between friends. Maybe as a test. Maybe to cause trouble. No one knows. One fringe tidbit. In a preserved 18th century household ledger from eastern Iceland, several fake love notes were tucked between pages of livestock records. The odd part: they were written by women to themselves using invented male names and identities. Whether it was wish fulfillment, practice, or some very early performance art is still up for debate. You shuffle through more of the desk's contents and find a small book, hand-stitched, dog-eared. It's a copybook. A place where someone practiced their letters. But as you flip through the pages, you see that half the entries are mock romantic. Dear Jonas, I think of you whenever I see a wheelbarrow. Which is often. I may require help. Was this sarcasm? Sincerity disguised as silliness? A private laugh never meant to be shared? Historians still argue whether these false letters were subversion, satire, or early emotional rehearsal. Were they ways to test feelings safely, or ways to mock the whole idea of romantic vulnerability? Either way, they exist. And they tell us something. Not all love letters were solemn. Sometimes, they were a game. You reach for another sealed envelope, yellowed with time. This one was sent. The address is real. But inside, nothing but an empty sheet. The message was the act of sending. A blank letter that still meant, I thought of you. Or maybe, I'm waiting. Or, in the more mischievous theory, guess who's thinking about you, you poor fool. It's oddly elegant. You lean back in the chair, the fire in the hearth behind you crackling softly. Imagine being the recipient of that blank sheet. Your heart races, your mind races faster. What did they mean to say? Why send nothing? Is it a riddle? A mistake? A statement? One version of this prank love letter lore involves a group of 3 siblings from the north who competed to write the most poetic, ridiculous love letters without ever identifying themselves. The winner was determined by whose recipient showed up first at their farm, furious, flattered, or both. Apparently, someone did show up. She married none of them. But the letters were found years later, preserved in a clay pot beneath the floorboards. That's the thing about anonymous or playful letters. They walk the line between flirtation and fiction. And in Iceland, land of sagas and storytelling, love didn't always need to be sincere to be worth writing. You step away from the desk and glance at the candle in the window. It's guttering now, the wax pooling fast. But in the waning light, you catch one last scrap pinned above the desk. If you're reading this, I probably love you. And just like that, the joke turns gentle. Because even a forged letter, even a blank page, even a prank built on runes and riddles, can carry real feeling. And real risk. So whether it was a shy smile behind a teasing line, or an honest yearning hidden in a pretend name, these letters, fake or not, mattered. Because they were still a way to say, I'm here. I feel. Even if I won't admit it out loud. And honestly, that's the most human thing of all. The road home is long, but your steps are slower now, not from fatigue, but from a kind of reverence. Tonight, you've walked through snow-covered valleys of whispers and half-said truths. You've crouched beside old runesticks, cracked open chests of secret letters, watched confessions bloom under starlight. But as you near the crest of the last hill, there's still one final place to visit. A cliffside library. No, not the kind with columns and shelves. This one's older. Stranger. Built into the rock, half hidden by a curtain of vines and ice. Locals used to call it Minnisbailey, the Nook of Remembering. It's not marked on maps. Not because it's lost, but because it was never officially there. And yet, people came. Because this was where the most private love letters went to become something else. Tonight, we arrive at the sacred, secret tradition of preserving love in communal silence. You pull aside the icy curtain and duck into the crevice. It's dark inside, but not empty. The walls are carved with grooves, slats, and cubbyholes. Inside each, a scroll. A bone token. A folded scrap of vellum. You don't touch them. You feel them. The room smells of cold earth and dry ink. One mainstream historical fact: Icelanders often had unofficial, community-run record sites, caves, crannies, even hollow stones where poems, histories, and letters were stored. While most focused on legal or spiritual documents, some clearly held personal writings, possibly love letters preserved anonymously. And here, It's undeniable. You kneel beside a notch in the stone and find a piece of driftwood tucked inside. On it. He will not know. But I must say it. Beside that, a folded scrap of rough paper, the ink so faint it looks like breath. If I vanish, may these words stay. May they count. These weren't messages meant to be sent. They were meant to exist, to witness. Not for a lover, but for the land. For the stone. For the future. Maybe even for you. You pick up a small tin box with a broken hinge. Inside, pressed like a flower, is a letter written on sheepskin parchment. It has no salutation. No name. Just a runic poem. You are the thread. The winter pulls. But still, you hold. You exhale slowly. Imagine the hands that wrote that. Calloused. Cold. Quiet. A person who maybe never kissed the one they loved. Who never saw a letter returned. But still, they wrote this. And instead of burning it, they housed it. Here. In a library of things no one was supposed to read. And yet, someone always would. One fringe tidbit. In some regions, children were told never to touch the hollow books, objects hidden in stone or tree roots, because they belonged to people who loved too much. It was said these objects would cry if disturbed. A superstition, sure. But maybe a warning, too. Don't mess with someone's unfinished story. Historians still argue whether places like this were real archive systems or spontaneous folklore sites. But whether organized or accidental, they existed. And they held something more than memory. They held permission. Permission to write anyway. To say what you couldn't say aloud. To admit that you loved, even if nothing came of it. Even if they never knew. You step deeper into the crevice. It narrows, until you can only reach one last cubby at arm's length. Inside is a flat river stone, smooth and cool. On it, 5 words carved so small you almost miss them. This, too, was real. Enough. You close your eyes. Let the stillness of the stone settle over you. That's the quiet truth at the end of all this. These letters, whether hidden, unsent, confessed, burned, laughed over, stitched into sleeves, or buried in snow, they weren't about getting the love back. They were about having it at all. They were proof that you dared. That you felt something so sharp and specific, it had to be written. That you loved someone even if they didn't know, didn't love you back, or weren't allowed to. And somewhere, across this cold and complicated land, others were doing the same. Whispering into bone. Scratching ink onto driftwood. Slipping messages into chimney stones. Telling the cliffs, the rivers, the sky. I loved. Let that be enough. You back out of the crevice slowly. The night is quiet again. The stars above you pulse gently. And below, in the distant village, a new fire crackles in someone's hearth. Maybe a love letter is being written right now. Or read. Or hidden. Or burned. But you, lucky, sleepy you, have heard them all. And now, before you go, let's ease down, together, into the soft end of the story. The path beneath your feet softens as you head home. The snow hushes around you like downy wool, and the air grows warmer not because the wind has stopped, but because your mind is quieter now. You've walked a long way tonight. Through ink-stained desks and rune-bitten grave markers. Through soft-spoken weddings and wild highland pranks. Through secret chests and hollow stones. Through the full spectrum of longing, funny, furious, silent, proud. You've heard the love letters of people who had almost nothing but still found a way to say I feel this. Some letters waited years for an answer. Some were never opened. Some were burned on purpose, others by accident. But every one of them mattered. Because in 18th century Iceland, love didn't travel on paper. It traveled in bone, in thread, in shared glances and coded prayers. And whether those stories ended in wedding cloaks or withered silence, they were real. Yours is real, too. So now, breathe deeply. Let that softness in your chest settle. Let the frost on the windows belong to someone else for a while. The stars will keep watch. The runes will stay carved. The wind might still whisper a name or two, but you don't have to chase them. You just have to sleep. Let your thoughts drift like lanterns, quiet, glowing, weightless. Tomorrow will come. But for now, tonight belongs to the ones who loved in silence, in secret, in stubbornness, and still wrote it down anyway. Good night, brave heart. Sleep warm.